Well, welcome to our webinar today, and thanks for joining us. My name is Dr. Elliott Dennis, and I'm an assistant professor and livestock economist with the Center for Agriculture Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And today is a part of our center's weekly webinar series, which typically happens every Thursday at noon Central Time. And so if you've attended in the past, we're grateful that you attended and glad to see you back. If you want to see a future schedule of the webinars that are coming up, feel free to visit our website, cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu. And today we're specifically focusing on labor, and it tends to be one of the most pressing issues that we get calls about, and specifically how to secure reliable employees to fill seasonal or even permanent needs. So in this webinar, we're going to be mainly aimed at helping producers and ag industry professionals understand available trends and options that can be used to navigate the complex maze of different agriculture visa programs. It will include kind of a state of where ag labor is at, what's been the historical use of these visa programs, what's an overview of some of the visa requirements, procedures, and compliance, and what are some of the, specifically, what are the employer obligations? To present, we have two people. We have Marcelo Castillo, research economist with USDA's Economic Research Service and the Resource and Rural Economics Division. He's written and presented extensively on ag labor issues in the United States, and we're glad to have him. And we'll later be joined by Brian Lisonbee. He's an agriculture and business immigration attorney. He's the owner of Lisonbee Immigration Law in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he grew up on a cow-calf and haying operation in Utah, and he'll present on those issues. So let's go ahead and get started. And Marcelo, why don't we turn it over to you for your presentation?
All right, sounds good. Let's see if I can share my screen here. All right, so I'm sharing my screen. And here are my slides. Can you see them?
Yep, it sounds good.
Awesome. All right, so let's get started. My name is Marcelo Castillo, and I'm an economist at ERS, as Elliott said. So today, I'll show you some findings from a report that we published last year. That report is mostly about the H-2A program in 2020. But the results that I'll show you today use the most recent data, which are the 2022 data. I'm also going to show you a thing or two from another report in H-2A that we published in 2021. As you may know, at ERS, we work with lots of farm labor data, but we don't engage as much as what we would like with farm employers and farm workers. And because of this, I think we can benefit quite a bit from any feedback you may have on our work. It would also be great if you could tell us the sort of things you would like to see in future ERS reports. And if you have any questions, you can ask them anytime. Hopefully, I'll see them as I'm presenting. Okay, so the primary goal of our reports in H-2A is to provide as much descriptive information about the program as possible using the best data at our disposal. So to be more specific, we first combine and clean all public data on H-2A job applications that are published by the Department of Labor. We then use that data to document how H-2A use varies across agricultural sectors, geography, the types of firms requesting H-2As, and we do a lot more. Now, for the most part, we focus on showing patterns of H-2A employment that have not gotten a whole lot of attention, but we leave explanations for these patterns for work in the future for other folks that work. In other words, we're just showing you what's in the data, but cannot always tell you why what we find is there. And one more thing to note is that we only show characteristics of the program that can be examined using the DOL disclosure data set. And because of this, we're not going to cover a lot of important issues, such as H-2A working conditions, violations of employment agreements, and that sort of thing. All right, so to give you some context to our findings, let's first talk about immigration and agriculture in the United States. As you know, immigrants play quite an important role in U.S. agriculture. So by some estimates, around 70% of farm workers in crop agriculture are immigrants. They're primarily from rural Mexico, and about 60% of them are not authorized to work legally in the United States. However, there are quite a few indications telling us that the supply of workers from rural Mexico is falling. For example, we have farmer reports that labor shortages have been increasing pretty much everywhere. Farm wages are rising in all regions, and there has been a fairly large increase in the employment of H-2As. Some likely causes for this decline in labor supply are falling fertility rates in rural Mexico, stronger enforcement of U.S. immigration laws, and we also have better employment opportunities in the Mexican economy. All right, perhaps not surprisingly, agricultural industries that are labor intensive are the ones that are most sensitive to to this falling labor supply. In crop production, we have fruits and vegetables, nursery and greenhouse that are particularly labor intensive. And within livestock, the most labor intensive industries, as most of you probably know, are aquaculture and dairy. So how can producers adjust to a falling labor supply? Well, if they choose not to decrease production, one thing they can do is to try to substitute labor with capital by mechanizing. And some producers are doing just that. Now, one problem with this approach is that for quite a few crops, the technology to mechanize is not quite there yet. In other cases, mechanizing can be really expensive, so it's not really a viable option. For some producers, at least eligible producers, a better option is to hire workers through the H2A program. Okay, so before showing you results, here's some background on H2A eligibility. So 3 major requirements. First, agricultural job needs to be temporary or seasonal. Second, the employer must show that hiring H2A workers is not going to have a negative effect on the wages of domestic farm workers. And to comply with this rule, employers need to pay H2A workers a minimum wage, which is set by DOL. And the last major requirement is that employers show that there are not enough domestic workers to fill the job. And to do this, employers must try to recruit U.S. workers before they can hire H2As. These are the 3 major eligibility criteria. All right, so moving on to results. So the major story about the program is pretty simple, it's growth. As you can see in this graph, H2A employment has increased a lot recently. So H2A jobs went from about 50,000 in 2005 to about 370,000 in 2022. Now H2A jobs have increased in all sectors and regions, though the increase has been more pronounced in some sectors and regions than in others. And this rapid increase has made it that, at least by some estimates, H2A workers now fill about 15% of all U.S. jobs in crop production. Though, as I'll show in just a second, this percentage varies a lot by location. All right, so one key contribution of our first report was to show how different sectors contributed to the recent increases in H2A employment. The sectoral groups that we chose are livestock, here in green, nursery and greenhouse in dark blue, field crops in gray, fruits in yellow, and vegetables at the bottom in light blue. And those may be a little hard to see in the graph, but H2A employment increased across all 5 of these sectoral groupings. And the increases were highest in fruits and vegetables, with the combined share of all jobs in these 2 sectors going from 49. So 49, you add the two bars at the bottom, from 49 to 67%. And fairly large increases also took place in seasonal and labor-intensive industries within field crops. For example, tobacco, seed corn, sugarcane, that sort of thing. Now, increases in employment were much smaller in livestock and nursery than in the other 2 sectors. And a likely reason for this, almost obvious, is that while these 2 sectors contain large and labor-intensive industries, dairy being a quintessential example, jobs in these industries tend to be year-round, so they're not going to qualify for H2A employment. And remember from before, H2A jobs have to be temporary or seasonal. And one thing you may have noted is that in this graph, we only go up to 2019. And the reason for this is that the data that we need to make this figure is no longer reported in the DOL data set. So 2019 was the last year we could do this in any reasonable way. All right, so what do H2A employment patterns look like across states? As you would expect, at least speaking generally, states with lots of H2A are those with lots of farm workers working in seasonal jobs. So the top 5 states, all of which had more than 25,000 jobs. In this map depicted in dark green, Florida, 14%, California, 12%. California is growing quite a bit. Georgia and Washington with around 9%, and North Carolina with 7%. You add all these up and you get 51%. So top 5 states take a little bit over half of all H2A jobs. Now, the number of H2A jobs in a state does not always line up perfectly with the number of seasonal farm jobs in that state. So for example, Georgia and California, they hire similar numbers of H2A, but Georgia's seasonal farm workforce is much smaller. As a result, Georgia is going to use H2A labor much more intensively than California. And on the right, we do mapping H2A intensity by state, where we measure intensity as the ratio of H2A wages to total labor expenditures. And the map shows that Georgia's H2A intensity was greater than 20%, while it was less than 5% for California. And a pattern that jumps out on this map, it's fairly obvious in here, is that states in the Southeast use H2A labor more intensively than nearly every other state. So the Southeast is pretty H2A intensive. I guess except for Nevada, but Nevada's relatively high H2A use is based on the fact that the state has low agricultural employment, and one of the primary employers in the state relies heavily on the H2A program. All right, so another important feature of the H2A program is concentration. And by that, all I mean is that a relatively small number of employers hire most H2A workers. And we can see this in this figure on the right. So the blue bars show the share of all H2A employers in the size category that is written right below it. The red bars show the share of all H2A jobs certified to those employers in the size category. And the size categories are based on the number of certified H2A jobs that an employer gets. That's a mouthful. So to give you an example, the blue bar above the 100 plus category tells us that the employer with 100 or more certified jobs constitute around 5% of all employers. The red bar next to it tells us that these employers with 100 or more jobs obtain around 67% of all H2A jobs. So 5% of all employers get more than 2/3 of all jobs. And in this chart, you can also see that most employers hire relatively few H2A workers. So you go all the way to the left, we can see that over 65% of all employers get only between 1 and 9 certified jobs. And these many, many small employers get only around 8% of all H2A jobs. All right, so now part of the reason why H2A employment is so concentrated is that many H2As are hired by farm labor contractors, by FLCs. And FLCs tend to ask for lots and lots of workers. So by DOL regulations, 3 types of employers can request H2A guest workers. We have individual farmers, we have growers associations, and we have FLCs. FLCs often provide H2A workers to multiple individual employers, and this partly explains why they tend to be some of the larger employers in the program. You can see that on the first bar on this figure shows that in fiscal year 2022, 44% of all H2A jobs went to FLCs. Individual farmers took another 52% of all jobs, and growers associations took the remaining 4%. Okay, another contribution of our report is to show that strong FLC participation in the H2A program is a relatively new occurrence. So in this figure here, we show trends in H2A jobs by type of employer from 2006 to 2022. And in the figure, we can see how the growth in overall H2A employment stems from growth in individual employers here in green, and growth in FLCs here in red. And there's little to no growth coming from growers associations. Now, while individual employers receive most H2A jobs over the entire period, the gap between the jobs going to farmers and FLCs has narrowed quite a bit. And as a result, the share of all jobs going to FLCs increased from 13% in 2006 to 44% in 2022, so almost half. All right, and in this next slide, you can see that there are pretty strong differences in the FLC share of H2A certifications across states. So the share is greater than 50% in California and Arizona, Georgia and Florida, and in quite a few Midwestern states. And these shares are quite low in some of the large H2A employer states, such as Washington. So Washington, New York, Louisiana have pretty small FLC shares. All right, I think I'm gonna skip this graph. It's not super technical, but could be a little boring. All right, so one more surprising feature of the H2A program is that many of these H2A FLC jobs are destined for farm out of state. Some of you may know an employer based in one state can request to employ H2A workers in another state, so for another farm perhaps. Or, so for the most part, individual employers and growers associations, the state of the employer is the same as the state of the work site. But this is not the case for FLCs. So in this figure, I'm showing you the total FLC H2A jobs here in green at the top, which I showed you a few slides back. And the blue line here represents FLC H2A jobs in state, and the red line represents FLC jobs out of state. And here we see that both types of FLC jobs are increasing. And we can also see that the share of total FLC jobs requested for out-of-state work sites is fairly large. In 2022, for example, around 36% of FLC H-2A employment was destined for farms out of state. So over 1/3 of all the jobs that FLCs are asking for are going to farms outside of their state in which they're based. All right, so one state that stands out for quote unquote sending H-2A workers to other states is Florida. As a matter of fact, around half of all jobs quote unquote sent out of state or to out of state work sites by FLCs come from FLCs based in Florida. So in 2022, Florida FLCs obtained around 65,000 total jobs, including 36,000 jobs in Florida and 29,000 in other states. And just to begin with, 65,000 jobs is like 18%, close to 18% of total jobs in the nation, all the jobs that are requested in the country. The top destinations for Florida FLCs were Georgia with 7,000 jobs, North Carolina and Michigan with around 4,500, Indiana with 3,000, and Illinois with 2,000. As a matter of fact, in Indiana and Illinois, Florida FLCs filled more than half of all the jobs that were requested in those two states. Okay, and the last thing that I want to briefly talk to you about are H-2A wages. Now, as you know, by regulation, employers have to pay H-2A workers at least the adverse effect wage rate, the AWAR. And for nearly all occupations, DOL sets the AWAR for a given state using the wages of crop and livestock workers in the previous year. The wages are taken from USDA's Farm Labor Survey, the FLS. FLS data are used to compute AWARs for 15 multi-state regions and separately for 3 states. The states are California, Florida, and Hawaii. So that there are 18 different of these aggregate AWARs, and all states in the same region have the same rate. Now in this map, we see that AWARs vary quite a bit across the U.S. So in 2023, so for fiscal year 2023, California had the highest AWAR at around $18.60. The AWAR was also pretty high in Washington, Oregon, at around 18, and Missouri and Iowa at around 17.50. Now the AWAR tends to be lower in the Southeast, and you can see in the graph, all the Southeastern states here in the lightest green had AWARs below $14.50. All right, and this final slide shows AWAR trends by region from 2011 to 2023. And there's a lot in there, but the point of the graph is not so you can pinpoint each individual region. But these two figures, we see that AWARs have been increasing pretty much everywhere. So that's the trend. They're going up everywhere. I think there's a hiccup from 2015 to 2017 in one of the regions. And on average, they've been going up by 4% per year nominally. And some agricultural employers argue that AWARs are increasing too fast, and thus perhaps they should be capped. And this is one of the regulatory changes to the H-2A program that was proposed by the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, that's being proposed by the FWMA. The FWMA was approved by the House in March 2021, but would eventually stall in the Senate. And I think, I believe it was recently reintroduced just a few months ago. The FWMA also proposed to freeze AWARs for 1 year and cap future increases at around 3% per year for the next 9 years after it was approved. And though I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, the last thing we do in our most recent report is to use some super simple methodology to estimate that freezing the AWAR for 1 year would quote unquote save H2 employers around $170 million. All right, and just to summarize, in our reports on H2A, we show that H2A employment has increased quite a lot since the 2000s. Certifications went from 48,000 in 2005 to 370,000 in 2022. H2A employment increased in almost every state, especially in labor-intensive industries with lots of jobs that are eligible for H2A employment. H2A employment is highly concentrated, and by that I mean that a relatively small number of employers hire most H2A workers. And part of the reason why H2A employment is so concentrated is that many H2As are hired by FLCs. FLCs tend to ask for lots of workers. And the lesson we show is that for fiscal year 2023, H2A wages are highest in the Pacific Coast and Midwest and lowest in the Southeast. though in recent years, H-2A wages have been increasing steadily across all regions. All right, and that concludes my presentation. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Marcelo. Appreciate the insights. And as a reminder, you got that chat message, but if you have questions about anything that Marcelo talks about or that Brian will talk about, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end. We plan to have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So if you do have questions, either specific questions or general ones, feel free to do so. All right, next we have Brian Lisonbee. As mentioned, he's an attorney with Lisonbee Immigration Law based out of Lincoln, Nebraska, ag and business immigration, and grew up on a cow-calf operation and haying operation in Utah. And we'll turn it over to Brian.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I think everyone can see my screen okay now. So I'll just go ahead and jump right into things. So I'm just going to be talking today a little bit about immigration solutions for agriculture. We're going to talk a little bit about all the different visa types, visa options that are available to people looking for solutions in this area of critical need. And part of my reason for giving this presentation, and part of the reason I'm really passionate about this, is I have quite a few clients in big ag. Most of my experience has been representing hog operations. And we bring in a lot of people from Mexico to support the breeding and farrowing operations at several pretty big companies. So they're always looking for ways to support their labor and employment staff and get people into the country. So it's always a challenge, and things have definitely got stricter, as was mentioned in Marcelo's presentation. U.S. immigration has been tougher this year, in my opinion, than they ever have before on immigration matters, which has surprised quite a few people, because in the immigration industry especially, a lot of people were very passionately angry about the Trump administration, about what they did with immigration law, and thought that the Biden administration would make things easier. And we've actually seen a lot more difficulty, actually, a lot of the consulates and embassies, for people trying to find immigration solutions for their labor and employment. So definitely a critical area of need. So just high level overview, visa options. There's quite a few visa options for ag employers. I won't talk in depth in this presentation about permanent visa options, but there are permanent visa options available for people. The term commonly used throughout the United States is a green card. These immigrant visa options, the EB1, the EB2, the EB3, those would be what we commonly refer to as green cards. And really, if you're doing ag, most of your work is going to be for professional workers or for low skill workers, which is going to fall in this EB3 category. Just generally, so everyone knows, if you're going to do a green card for somebody, you're looking at probably a 2-ish year process, 2 to 3 year process right now, to get the labor certification and eventually get the I-140 filed and the green card application filed. So it's a quite a lengthy process right now. But if you have a valuable employee and it's really difficult for you to fill positions, then this can be a really good option to go with the green card options. I'm going to talk more about these non-immigrant visa options, though, which would be what we consider temporary employment. And there's quite a list of them. There's TNs, there's O1s, H1Bs, H1B1s, B1s, J1s, H2A, H2B, like we've talked about already, and then F1s. So I'll just walk through each of those at a high level. We won't go into too much detail because I just want to get the information out there. So I'm going to start with TN. And the reason I'm starting with TN is because, in my opinion, this is probably the best solution outside of H2A for ag employment. The TN is basically a treaty-based visa between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This used to be called the NAFTA agreement. It's changed recently to the USCMA. It carves out some positions of need in the United States that can be filled by Canadian nationals or by Mexican nationals. Examples for the ag industry would be agriculturists, animal breeders, animal scientists, apiculturists, biochemists, so on. This is quite a lengthy list, but basically there's quite a few categories of employment for farmers or ranchers that you can fill with Canadian or Mexican applicants using this treaty-based visa. My biggest clients often will use this animal breeder category very commonly. I joke often with my family that probably at least 50, maybe even 80% of all the pork we eat in America was probably raised by Mexican nationals who are working in the US on TN visa. There's a lot of people in the US working on TN who are raising hogs, because this is a really important category for bringing people into to fill that area of critical need. And a lot of the big producers would have a real difficult time finding employment, finding ways to employ people for those positions without this category, in my opinion, because it's really difficult to fill these positions with H-2A employees, because it's hard to prove that it's seasonal work. So TN is really helpful for that. The other category I'll often use is this engineer category, agricultural engineering, things like that. Most of these positions require a bachelor's degree. Actually, almost all of them require at least a bachelor's degree. So for example, for an animal breeder, the bachelor's degree has to be related to the area of employment or the field. And so you're looking at people with veterinarian medicine degrees, agricultural engineering degrees, animal science degrees, biology with an emphasis in animal production, things like that. The job offer must match the category. The person, when they come into the US, come in for an initial period of 3 years, and that can be extended in 3-year increments. And you can extend it either through sending your employee back to the consulate to renew it in their home country, or they can renew it through USCIS. And it's a temporary visa, so really it shouldn't be used as a permanent solution, but there isn't really a real cap on the number of years you can have a TN for. So we will find a lot of people in the US working on it for really long periods of time. I wouldn't suggest that, but I definitely have clients that have they'll tell me, they're like, why would we ever want to sponsor a green card for this person when we can just have them on TN for their whole life? They've been in the country for 30 years on TN. I'm like, well, that's really risky. Like, I probably wouldn't suggest going that route, but even though it's a temporary visa, you'll often see people in the US working on it for long periods of time. Then there is a difference in the application process for Canadians and Mexicans. Mexicans have to get a visa to enter on it. Canadians, it's a really simple process. They just go to the border with their petition. They process it at the airport or at the Border Patrol station in Canada, and they come across the border, get an updated I-94, and they go to work. Super easy. There's not a lot of employer obligations in addition to what you do for your regular employees. So it's a really flexible visa. There's not even really a wage requirement, though in most of the petitions I will file, I'll include a statement about the wage. So you can, it's a really flexible option. It's one that I really like to use with my ag clients. F1 visa is another one I see leveraged pretty commonly in the ag industry. F1's a student visa. It has nothing to do with their employer. It has everything to do with their school. But F1 students can work while they're completing their degree or upon the completion of their degree using either what's called CPT, OPT, or STEM OPT. CPT, they can't work full time, and it's relatively limited, but it's while they're completing their degree program. So let's say someone comes into work to the US to complete a degree in ag economics at Kansas State or something. And while they're completing that degree, they can get a position working for an employer related to their field. They can work on that during their program. Upon completion of their program, they have 1 year of what this OPT, this optional practical training, that they can use upon graduation. It's relatively straightforward. Most of the process is completed with the school. The employer doesn't have a ton of obligations with it. Now, the STEM OPT is a little bit different. It's available for people who complete STEM degrees, which would be science, technology, engineering, math, which most agricultural degrees would fall in this category. They can have 2 more years in addition to their 1 year of OPT So you can get a student who's completed a US-based degree to work after completion of their degree for 3 years in the United States without really paying for much for their sponsorship, because most of this will be done through the school. The STEM OPT, you'll have to meet with the student several times throughout the year. They need to work full time, which means 20 plus hours. You'll have to be an E-verified employee. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. There's a training plan you have to fill out, but it's really, really straightforward. So this is a good option. We see it utilized quite a bit in the ag industry as well. Another good option is the J1 trainee or exchange visitor program. The problem with this program that I often run into with clients is that it's pretty expensive. That's really the downside to this program. But when you don't have a lot of other options, a lot of people will use it. If someone from a foreign country has completed a degree in a field or substantial employment in a field, and they've become kind of like an expert, then they can utilize this as a trainee or come over as an exchange visitor to work under this program. It's pretty flexible. It's a pretty decent program. But again, it's just expensive. You have to work with the Department of State, and you have to have a sponsoring agency sponsor the employees. Those sponsoring agencies have fees that can run from like $4,000 plus per person that comes over. I have seen this picking up with my ag clients. More and more are utilizing this program just because they're having a harder time finding employees through the more traditional visa options. So it's a good option. It's just a little more pricey. H-1B, this is something a lot of people have probably heard of. It's in the news quite a bit. Basically, H-1B is a temporary visa that's good for 3 years at a time, and you can renew it for a maximum of 6 years. There's exceptions to that where you can extend beyond 6 years, but just think of it as renewing for up to 6 years for the most part. It's subject to a cap, so it's a little bit more hairy there, but the cap registration fees are pretty low. It's $10 this last year to register someone in the H-1B cap, which is held every April. If their petition is selected in the cap, then you file an I-129 petition. Depending on the size of your company, the fees for that can range somewhere between like around $1,000 to around $2,400. So it can be a little bit more expensive, but it's not a bad option if you're hiring someone in a specialty position, which means the position must require a bachelor's degree or equivalent, and the person has a bachelor's degree or its equivalent. Not as common of an option for most of my ag clients, just because a lot of the labor they're looking for isn't in specialty occupations, but we do see this option leveraged a little bit in the ag industry. H-1B1 and E3, these other two options are very similar to the H-1B program, except the one difference is these are treaty-based visas. The H-1B1's a treaty between Chile, Singapore, and the U.S., based on a treaty between Chile, Singapore, and the U.S. Pretty much the same requirements for H-1B, except there's no cap. So when you when you file an H-1B1, you can be sure that that employee will be onboarding with your company. E3 is very straightforward. It's for Australians based on a treaty between the US and Australia. Same thing. It's specialty occupation visa like the H-1B. Very, very flexible, pretty easy to obtain, but the person has to have a bachelor's degree or its equivalent. The position must require that as well. For all three of these visas, the H-1B, H-1B1, and the E3, they have pretty similar rules. You have to pay the wage that's determined by the Department of Labor, which you're going to submit what's called a labor condition application that specifies what that wage should be, and the Department of Labor is going to come back and approve that LCA. But sometimes it can be a little more pricey. It can be a little more expensive to pay these employees than what you're probably paying some of your other employees. So again, we just don't see this option utilized quite as much as we would like a TN, an F1 student, or a J1 trainee. But it is a good option. And then there's the H2A and the H2B. We've talked quite a bit in length about the H2A. Both programs, H2A and H2B, are for low skilled temporary work. The difference is the H-2Bs for agricultural workers. You must demonstrate a need for those workers, basically that there's a seasonal need. That seasonal need can be something like my crops grow during the summer, or there's a increase in the number of hams being sold every November because of Thanksgiving. And so we need to onboard more farm labor to raise pigs during this period of time. So you just got to prove that there's a seasonal need. Once you do, the worker can get a visa for 3 years. They can work for that seasonal period, which is usually 9 months or so. But that visa can be extended for up to 3 years. And the creative thing I see a lot of employers doing is, and most ag employers will have seasonal needs, but they'll have 2 or 3 seasonal needs throughout the year, right? So like maybe you have a peak load or peak need coming in November, but then you have another need at the farm in January or March of the next year. And so what you'll be able to do is keep a worker around for 3 years without really having a gap in their employment based on other needs at your farm. Just make sure you're complying with the regulations and the rules if you're doing that. There's quite a few regulations, obligations, and procedures that need to be followed by employers who are sponsoring someone in the H-2A or H-2B program. We won't go into all of those because we could give a 3 or 4 hour presentation on the rules and procedures for H-2A and H-2B program. They're pretty, even though there's quite a few of them, like when an employer hires H-2A, there's a lot of materials available that really walk you through how to do it. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just there's a lot of them. A couple of the high level ones are that you have to pay for travel to the job and work sites. There's special rules for termination, no-shows, abscondment, early completion of the work. You have to provide housing. You must let the people work for the specified number of hours in your contract. So there's quite a few rules, but it's a great program. It's really a great program, and it's continuing to increase in its usage, as was talked about earlier in the program. I will say, I guess, just maybe a high level note is there's been a lot of movement in Congress to get another H-2 visa specifically for a lot of the animal breeder sector. Hopefully we see something coming in the next couple of years. They've been politely calling it the H-2C program. Hopefully it exists. Hopefully we can get something done with Congress in the next couple of years that will provide more relief for a lot of the big animal production corporations. H-2B, I won't talk about this in a lot of detail as well. It's very similar to the H-2A program, except it's for low-skilled temporary non-agricultural workers. What I see clients using this for would be like people who are fixing up equipment or cleaning out facilities, or people who are processing meat in big processing facilities. So there is a place in the ag sector definitely for the H-2B program. It's ran very similar to the H-2A program. The difference would be mainly that there's a cap on the number of employees that can, a cap on the number of people who can come into the U.S. on H-2B. I will tell you that they've increased that cap every single year. They've granted additional H-2B visas because of the need. There's just a lot of people working on this in the United States, so it's a really good option. A lot of similar obligation and rules for the employers when employees come over on H-2B as H-2A. Yeah, just a couple more visa types. I'll get through these quickly because I want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. But L-1A and L-1B, I have seen employers leverage this recently in the U.S. For ag workers. L-1A is basically for executives or managers who are working abroad in an affiliated office to your corporation for a year. Some of the really big farming operations or big ag operations will have corporations in foreign countries. If you have an employee who's worked there for at least 1 year in the previous 3, this can be an option. L-1B is for people who have specialized knowledge relating to your organization. And so it's a little more flexible than L-1A. Both are good options. Both visas give you a 3-year initial stay. L-1B can be extended up to 5 years, and L-1A can be extended up to 7 years. Really, compliance and obligation wise, you just have to make sure you have a qualifying relationship with the foreign company. You have to be doing business in the United States. You have to comply with regular employment and labor laws. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of similar to all the obligations with like the H-1B or TN program. So not as many obligations, but there isn't really a wage requirement. O1A and O1B, you won't see this used a lot in the ag industry, but well, you will actually for really big ag or science, or like the Monsantos of the world, big companies with a lot of scientists. You'll see using this. There's just really high standards for the O1 visa because it's for individuals possessing extraordinary ability, and usually in the ag industry, this is going to be in science. So if you're bringing in an O1 employee, they're going to have extraordinary ability, meaning they've written a lot of papers, they've published a lot, they've been cited a lot, they have patents, things like that. They're valid for 3 years initially. You can extend them forever in 1 year increments. They're actually relatively cheap to file. It only costs $460 to file an O1. But they just are pretty high level employees and very, very impressive people usually. So just not utilized as much in the ag industry unless it's a big corporation that's doing research or something like that, that's producing large scale equipment or vaccines or something. B1, we won't talk about this. Maybe we should just skip B1. Most people aren't going to be using it. It's only good for 1 to 6 months. It's basically a visa that allows you to come in and conduct business in the United States, like attend meetings and things. And really, you can't do much more than that on the B1. So it's not super useful, but it's sometimes used in the ag industry. That's all I had. This is my contact information. If you want to talk more about visa options or you have any questions, you can email me or reach out anytime and I'll make myself available.
Thanks, Brian, for the information. Once again, if you've got questions for Brian or Marcelo, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll get to them. We had a few come in. First one is for you, Marcelo, from Barb. She says, are locally owned seed corn detasseling companies considered FLCs? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
That's a tough question. I actually do not know. I believe, I mean, if they're contracting to other farms nearby, they might be considered FLCs. But if they're just a single operation, I don't think they would.
So maybe then talk about what would be an operation that would be considered an FLC in general.
Usually, I mean, what an FLC does is they just hire folks, just recruit for you, and they bring them to your operation and deliver the workers. So something like that. It's an arm's length transaction.
So intermediate. They're not the ones necessarily, detasseling, but they might be recruiting the workers to go detassel.
Kinda. So they will be the ones going to detassel for you in the sense that they will be present while their workers are detasseling for you.
Okay.
So that's usually how the arrangement takes place, at least to my knowledge.
Okay, good. Thanks. Next one would be for you, Brian. It says, the question is, while we have this H-2A system in place for temporary ag workers, can any of those H-2As translate to green cards for workers? And so you had talked a lot about these individual programs. What's the transition process from taking a temporary worker to a permanent worker?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely, you can sponsor an H-2A employee for a green card. It's a little tricky. So the tricky part is the H-2A visa it's truly a temporary visa, super temporary. And like we talked about earlier, like for 9 months or less, right? So the way to sponsor somebody would be you have to be able to prove that there's no qualified US applicants for the position you're offering somebody. You can even do that for like, if you're in rural America, you can sponsor a pizza delivery person from a foreign country for a green card. As long as you can prove that there's no other qualified applicants for the position and you've gone through the labor certification process. So what that means is you're going to be filing a prevailing wage determination with the Department of Labor. They're going to tell you how much you should be paying that employee. which you probably already know from in the H-2A program because you've gone through a similar process. And actually, the perm process is very similar to the H-2A process, which is kind of interesting. Then you advertise for the position. If no qualified workers are hired for the position or applied to the position, that you turn away, or you hire everyone that applies because you just have such a high need for the position, then you can file what's called the permanent labor certification application with the Department of Labor. That application is taking around a year to process right now. Once that process is completed, you file what's called an I-140, and you can sponsor those employees for a green card. But it's a long process. What the problem with the H-2A program is, a lot of times people will run out of time on the H-2A before that process is complete. And so they will have returned to their home country. And then when they come back in, you can, a year later or so, you can sponsor them for the green card, or you can sponsor them for the green card from abroad. So a longer process. Once their green card application is pending, though, the one thing to remember is that if they departed the United States, then they wouldn't be allowed back in. So once it's pending, they need to stay in the United States until the green card is approved, which they're allowed to because they have an adjustment of status application pending.
So to follow up on that, Brian, thanks for that. If someone is thinking that they're maybe wanting to transition some workers that they're thinking about recruiting to permanent, is there a visa program that's better suited to do that?
Yeah, if you're, I mean, for H-2A employees, it's really hard to find a better program. Super hard to find a better program because they're not going to qualify for one of the other visa options because it's a low skilled worker visa. Okay. So I would say probably not. Most of your people won't be able to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks. And this is for once again for you, Brian. It says that why does the TN only apply to Mexican nationals and not other Hispanic Latino countries?
Yeah, because Congress made a treaty with Mexico for the visa and not with any other country. And really, it's Canada and Mexico, and it's just simply there's not a treaty in place with another country that allows people to come in on TN.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think for us, I think in Nebraska, some of the people that we see also as well are people from South Africa. I think when you talk to a lot of people, South Africans tend to be ones that are here as well. Okay, so maybe let's take for both of you, Marcelo, and why don't we start with Marcelo and then Brian, to say, help us understand why you believe it's more difficult or expensive for professionally trained individuals to find employment in the U.S. than a skilled laborer. A lot of employers aren't able or willing to pay the fees to sponsor these folks, so they may return to graduate school or something to stay here, even if they're performing a professional role with a BS or MS degree. So why don't we start with Marcelo, and then we'll go to Brian.
Yeah, that's another one that's very difficult for me to answer as a, the USDA employee, like commenting on something that, okay, heavily politically charged up. Yeah, I think I'll punt to Brian on this one.
Nice. I can talk about politics. So no, the reason why it's probably more expensive for professional workers to obtain employment authorization in the US is because in my opinion, Congress has decided that businesses that are hiring professional skilled workers. Oh, wait. I'm answering this the opposite way, right? We're saying that H-2As are more expensive. Why are H-2As more expensive? Is that the question?
Right.
That's a great question. There's really not a great answer. And I'll be honest, like I actually don't know if that's actually 100% true. I think it's more expensive for the amount of time they're working on the visa. But like if you get into completing a perm process for somebody, you've sponsored them on an H-1B, they're renewing that every year for years. Big employers will end up spending somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 just to get an employee their work authorization to a green card. So it can be fairly expensive, but they definitely Congress in the United States definitely hasn't really like. I just don't think they're very in touch with their constituents when it comes to ag. They definitely don't make a lot of rules and laws that are easy for small operations or small farmers to really make it, or small businesses for that matter. There's not a lot of incentives for small businesses or small ag to jump into really expensive immigration processes, unless you have to, because there's no other option.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Brian. Marcelo, this is related to that question. Maybe you can talk about the prevailing wage rate. You were talking about that adverse wage rate that you were talking about. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how that's get calculated. And you had mentioned that the Midwest would be one of the more expensive places. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So at least for the, till very recently, there was a single AWAR for a region. Now there was an exemption made very recently in which a few occupations that are not measured in the Farm Labor Survey. Farm Labor Survey is the source for most of these wages. So occupations that were not measured in the FLS now are being measured using a different survey. I think the OES, the Occupational Employment Survey by the Department of Labor. But anyways, so AWARs are measured using the Farm Labor Survey, which is a USDA survey. This survey only samples direct hires, so only folks that are being directly employed by farmers, so not FLCs. So that's one big difference. I guess another thing that usually comes about is the fact that the FLS not only measures wages, but they also measure other types of compensation. So bonuses and other things get set into the AWAR. So a lot of folks believe that the AWAR is higher than it should be because it includes this other forms of compensation. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
if you want to know
great.
anything.
Yeah, that's great.
That,
Thanks for that. Okay, this is for you, Brian. So let's say someone's listening to this and they're new to this process. They think maybe H2A is something that they want to do. Talk through them. What does that process look like from I want to do this program to that employee starts working?
Yeah, and I think I saw this question in the chat. They were asking, like, should we hire a lawyer? I guess my first thing I would say is maybe I shouldn't say this because I am a lawyer, but I would never tell somebody that you have to hire a lawyer for any immigration service, which is probably the wrong thing for me to say on a webinar, right? Because I'm trying to sell my services. I'm trying to gain business, right? Like I'm trying to grow. But really, like if you're a small outfit and you can't afford lawyer fees, don't be afraid to jump into immigration. There's good resources out there published by the USDA or by the government or by the Department of Labor or by USCIS that provide the guidance that's needed to really go through these programs and get these things done. That all said, like if you don't have time for that and you don't want to mess something up and you're really worried about it, get a lawyer or at least get somebody to consult with you to make sure that you're complying with the programs, because there's quite a few rules that you want to make sure you're complying with. But like and I think I showed it in my presentation, the Department of Labor has a pamphlet all about H2A compliance and regulations that you can download. It's a PDF, so it's some of that stuff's pretty straightforward, but it's nice to have somebody with experience. If you want to jump into the H2A program, and there's quite a few steps with it, like there's you file a labor certification with the Department of Labor. Once that's complete, you've advertised for the position, shown that you have a need in your area of employment to hire these employees. Then you can file an I-129 petition with USCIS. It's a pretty straightforward process. It doesn't take too much time, but it can take at least several months to complete. And you can hire a lawyer to do that. It's definitely worth your time if you're worried about complying with things. But if you feel pretty sophisticated and you just don't have the funding to pay for a lawyer, then you can do it on your own as well. I think I answered the question.
Yeah. I maybe for Julia, if I could just add to this, that what Brian's talking about is after you've identified someone and you want to go through that process. Now we probably should have another webinar on what's that process to identify people, and there's agencies that are out there that can help you identify people in other countries. So I mentioned the South Africans. There are certain agencies that will find South Africans to come over here. So they make that connection. So what is that process once you find someone to apply for the H-2A process? So, but yeah, Marcelo, maybe you can talk. Gabriela asked, talk more about workers in Nebraska related to meat packing. So in seasonal periods when we do more agriculture workers that come in from other states. So obviously we have peak times when we process meat. Maybe you can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm not an expert in meat packing, but I can tell you that at least from my experience, I don't think meat packing workers are qualifying for H-2A employment. Mostly because I think meat packing by itself is considered manufacturing. It's not even considered agriculture. So at least to my knowledge, I'm not sure if there's any sort of meat packing in H-2A. At least I'm not familiar with that. But maybe Brian, you can add something to that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I agree. I don't think it works for H-2A, but there are a lot of H-2B employees working at meat packing facilities. There's a lot. So H-2B is the program that they're using for meat packing.
Yeah. So then Marcelo, then when you were talking about the livestock and the animal products, that 4% that makes up all H-2A programs, those would primarily be in, hog operations or I was thinking even like sheep operations, like a pastoralist.
I actually have a table in front of me so I could remember a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there are a few exemptions from the year-round requirements, and I think sheep herders are one of them. Even though I think that the number of sheep herders has declined because they changed the wages. I think they raised the wages, they're really low, and they like tripled them a few years ago. But the top industries within livestock are open range livestock with sheep herders, and there's, I think, open range also has exemptions, so you're qualifying. Beef, there's I think 20%, at least in 2019, 20% of folks in livestock were for bees. You have crawfish in Louisiana, it's like 15%. Mm-hmm. I think you have horses, fish, chickens, but yeah, most of it is seasonal work in seasonal industries within livestock.
Yep.
At least to my knowledge, dairy has very, very few. Yep. I think only very temporary work would be qualifying. Yep. For the issue.
Great. And Maru mentioned that says in their experience being an immigrant it's much more advantageous to have a lawyer because the immigration inquiries tend to be so intricate. So thanks for your comment, Maru, and I think it's a good way to kind of wrap it up. Marcelo and Brian, thanks for being on with us today and sharing your insights and obviously all your hard work over years of experience. So, and as I mentioned, we'll provide their contact information. If you do have questions or comments or want to follow up with them, they've both suggested that they're more than happy to do so. And thanks everyone for visiting with us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu. So you can go back and rewatch some of those questions. We'll also provide the slides where you can download and look at those as well. And you can also register for upcoming webinars. And as you close out your Zoom window today, you'll see a brief survey that asks you for your opinion and feedback. Please answer that. We value your feedback and it helps us inform the additional webinars that we have. And once again, Marcelo, Brian, thanks for joining us. Thanks for everyone who's took the time to attend, and hope have a great rest of your Thursday and hope to see you back here next Thursday.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.